Amelia Gentleman, and welcome to the Great Big Book Club. We're going to talk about your new book, The Windrush Betrayal. Do you want to hold it up? So this book is an excellent and essential read. It's the story of your reporting for the Guardian newspaper on the threat of deportation of numerous people who'd been in this country since childhood, that is for 40 or 50 years, and who came here legally but had no documentation. They became known as the Windrush Generation, and it's the story of incompetence and bullying by the state, of an appalling racist government policy, the hostile environment, but also the story of how you were able to change lives as a result of your journalism. So it's a gripping read, and you've won 6 awards already for this book, and you're shortlisted for the Orwell Prize. Can you tell us how it all started?
Yes, thank you, Charlotte, for being here, for asking me to do this. I've been writing about Windrush-related issues now for probably 2.5 years. And it began with just one email from a charity in Wolverhampton who were really worried about one of their clients, a woman called Paulette Wilson, who had arrived in Britain at the age of 10, and who had been here as all her life since the age of 10, living, working in various places. For a while she worked at the House of Commons as a chef, totally law-abiding grandmother. She'd been arrested and told that she was facing deportation back to Jamaica, the country that she left as a child. So they were really concerned because they had tried to stop this process but hadn't been able to. And I went to interview her. She was luckily released with intervention from her MP shortly before being deported. So I was able to interview her, and we published her story in The Guardian. And immediately I began to get emails from other people who said, you need to talk to my father, you should talk to somebody else I know who is in very, very similarly difficult situations. And it just was extremely confusing to begin with, because it wasn't at all clear why the Home Office was targeting a group of people who were approaching retirement and who appeared to be entirely blameless and not needing to be arrested or threatened with deportation.
Can you remind people about the hostile environment, as it was called, the policy that became very well known under Theresa May, when Theresa May was Home Secretary? I think in the book you remind us that on Valentine's Day in 2013, the official Home Office Twitter account declared, "Roses are red, violets are blue. If your marriage is a sham, we'll be on to you. Hashtag Happy Valentine's Day."
Yeah,
So,
I mean, it was an extraordinary policy, and it's a policy that still remains entirely unrepealed and unreformed, despite a number of promises to address it. It was something that was introduced from 2012 onwards by Theresa May when she was Home Secretary, but with the absolute backing and enthusiasm of David Cameron, who was Prime Minister then. The idea was that the coalition government had a commitment to reducing net migration down to the tens of thousands, which was an entirely unrealistic and unachievable goal. And it was something that they were very aware that they were making no progress with. So one of the things that they tried to do was to increase the atmosphere of hostility towards people who couldn't prove that they were living in the UK legally. And a kind of in parallel with that, there was this whole process across government of cutting budgets. And so the Home Office was contracting. There were fewer and fewer people working in immigration enforcement, and yet they had this enormous task of cutting migration numbers. So what they did, and it was in a way a kind of very inspired, genius idea was that they outsourced a lot of the immigration enforcement roles to people beyond the Home Office, so landlords and employers and doctors and people working in banks and the people who kind of give you your phone contract. All of those people suddenly had to start checking whether or not the applicant was eligible for whatever it was, and whether they were able to prove that they were living in the UK legally. And it turned out that a lot of people who were entirely legally living in the UK were not able to prove it because they didn't have documentation. And it was quite a new thing for us, because for years we don't have ID cards. We're not actually a country that particularly has ever gone around demanding that people show their papers. But suddenly this became really much more a requirement. And for those people who were living here legally but weren't able to prove it, the consequences were really catastrophic. So we saw people like this woman, Paulette Wilson, being detained and told she was going to be deported. Other people lost their jobs, were made homeless, were refused vital NHS treatment, and basically had their lives kind of completely upended, and were unable to persuade anybody within the Home Office that a mistake had been made and that actually they weren't here illegally. They shouldn't be classified as immigration offenders. And the amazing thing was that they were just comprehensively ignored for years by pretty much everyone within the Home Office and elsewhere.
I mean, it's extraordinary. You talked about one woman who went to report a rape and found herself being investigated for her status here. So can you just explain why they're called the Windrush Generation?
Yeah, so in 1948, there was this, two things happened. There was a bit of legislation that opened Britain up to all of its former colonies, or to its colonies at that time, and allowed a process of free movement between people who were living in Australia, in Canada, South Africa, and in the Caribbean. And I think at that time, the politicians thought that there would be a lot of movement between Australia and the UK, but there wasn't an understanding that by opening it up, there would be a sudden movement of tens of thousands of people from the Caribbean. And really, ever since then, this kind of debate about immigration has begun and continued with real focus on whether or not Britain can accommodate lots of people arriving from the Caribbean. And all of those kind of racist subtext to that discussion began in 1948 when the Empire Windrush arrived, that had 500 people on it from the Caribbean. And that's a kind of beginning of multicultural Britain that's been celebrated for years. But it also kind of gave its name to this Home Office scandal latterly, because it wasn't obviously those people who were on the ship, but it was their children and the next generation down who had come entirely legally, often in response to active recruitment drives by the NHS or by London Transport to take up work here, and then who were later classified kind of wrongly as being here illegally by this dual process. Firstly, the implementation of the hostile environment, but also because throughout the 1950s and 60s, immigration legislation became tighter and tighter in response to this kind of sense that actually Britain didn't want to have so many immigrants. And so all of those people, around 500,000 who'd come here entirely legally, found that they'd kind of, unless they'd taken active steps to get British citizenship, which is a process that you had to take, you had to pay for, many of them assumed they were already British. many of them, when they arrived, had come on a kind of British passport. But those people who hadn't actually taken steps were pushed into this grey area of illegality, really without knowing.
Yeah, and you talked about how the records that had been kept, their landing cards, were over the years either destroyed or there was accidents like flooding. And so when they wrote to the Home Office saying that they'd been here, the Home Office wrote back saying there's no record of you, but that wasn't their fault.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is extraordinary. The Home Office is this kind of massive institution, employs thousands and thousands of people, and it seems to combine this sort of institutional malice with sending out those kind of tweets that you talked about from Valentine's Day, alongside an extraordinary level of incompetence, so that repeatedly that there were these kind of fires or floods or piles of documents that got thrown down a lift shaft. And actually there was a decision to destroy a whole archive of people's landing slips because they were moving from one building to another, and somehow there wasn't an appreciation that these were incredibly vital bits of proof.
You mentioned Paulette, but that you then went on to meet lots of other people. Can you tell us some of the other stories that you reported on?
Yeah, so as soon as we published a piece about Paulette, I was contacted by the son of a man called Anthony Bryan, who'd also been sent to immigration detention for 5 weeks and was also fighting off deportation back to Jamaica, which he had left as a 9-year-old 50 years before. And there's a really, really amazing BBC drama that's just come out and is still available on iPlayer about him, called Sitting in Limbo. And his life was also completely ruined because he'd been here working, having a family, doing absolutely nothing wrong, and couldn't understand why it was that he had been arrested and detained and threatened in really alarming ways. I met a woman called Jocelyn John, who came here from Grenada at the age of 4, who again went to primary school, secondary school here. She worked for a long time in the Ritz and then at the Hilton, and she also had a series of incredibly menacing letters from the Home Office telling her that she was here illegally and offering her a so-called voluntary return. And in the end, she was so frightened by the kind of tone of the letters that she was being sent. And also she was unable to work, so she was totally without any money. So she signed up for one of these voluntary repatriations, a kind of self-deportation, went back to Grenada, a country she hadn't visited or lived in for 58 years, and obviously had a completely horrific time, and was stuck there until her brother called because he'd seen news of this scandal emerging on the television in 2018, and she was flown back at the government's expense on British Airways, but is still waiting for compensation. So people's lives were really, really radically and kind of horrifically affected by this policy. And I think for me, the most disturbing thing was that it went on for years and no one really noticed. It's just really amazing.
No, it's extraordinary. I mean, also, as you point out, the fear that landlords felt, or, you know, the headmaster of a school which had employed one of the people you interviewed, who all felt the pressure would be on them, that they might face a prison term for employing somebody who is, or renting to somebody who is an illegal immigrant. I mean, it's sort of, it worked on lots of levels, it seems. So it was really lots of people.
It was a really clever policy because it outsources all of the responsibility for doing these time-consuming immigration checks to individuals. And the problem with that, as lots of people pointed out, is that if you're not an expert in immigration checks, then you're not going to know whether somebody's visa is correct or not. And as a landlord, you're likely then to take shortcuts to decide whether or not somebody that you want to rent a property to is actually here in the country legally. And that's where you get this kind of inbuilt discrimination, because if you've got no idea what to do, then you're likely to be looking at someone's skin color, looking at their name, looking at their accent, and thinking to yourself, is this person here legally or not? And there's an ongoing challenge in the Supreme Court at the moment about whether or not this legislation is racially discriminatory.
Also, the NHS, who are already overburdened, were being asked to check patients who were coming in. And you had one interviewee who was refused cancer treatment, or at least was given an estimate for an enormous bill for his cancer treatment. And that felt extraordinary too, that he had to wait for urgent cancer treatment. Is he all right now?
Yeah, he is fine. He got treatment after the case became public in The Guardian, and it was actually the first time that any politicians really paid any attention to all of the pieces that we were publishing in The Guardian. And I think that's because there's something about the NHS that we feel very protective of, and the idea that somebody was being denied this life-saving treatment, or being told he had to pay £54,000 for it.
You're outwardly a calm person, quite quietly spoken, but you say you became concerned, horrified and angry in the process of reporting this. And as I got further through the book, I could really feel that. I wondered, how did it feel hearing these truly terrible stories of people? You describe it as a story about who gets listened to in Britain and who gets ignored. Were you ever worried that you might not be able to help them, that your reporting wouldn't make a difference?
Yeah, because it took 6 months before really any attention was taken and any action happened. And after about 4 months, I think, of writing story after story, really reporting in kind of quite painstaking detail how people's lives were being really badly affected, I began to feel rather mournful, I suppose, about the power or the possibility of this journalism to make any change whatsoever, because it was really ignored very successfully for a long time. And I think in previous bits of reporting I've done for The Guardian, I've had a similar feeling that you can kind of write really earnest pieces highlighting holes in government policy, or showing, how reforms to the welfare system are having very, very detrimental impact on lots of vulnerable people. And, Guardian readers will feel really outraged and furious, and yet very little concrete happens as a result. So yeah, absolutely, I felt I did feel worried that maybe all of these people had kind of poured out their difficulties and exposed themselves to perhaps quite unwelcome publicity for no real dramatic impact. But that did change.
Yeah, because your reporting contributed to the resignation of the Home Secretary, then Amber Rudd, in 2018. Can you remind us what happened there?
Yeah, so this issue had kind of been bubbling away beneath the surface, and until April 2018, when we had the Commonwealth Heads of Government Summit in London. And that is an occasion which in normal circumstances would be just a kind of not very exciting diplomatic event that no one pays very much attention to. But in 2018, there was a bit more of a desire for it to be seen as an important event because we were approaching Brexit. We needed to secure kind of new international partnerships, and a lot of effort was being thrown at this event to make it a success. The leaders of the Caribbean countries had become aware that a lot of their nationals, or a lot of people who've been born in their countries, were being extremely badly treated by the British government. And they had got together just before the meeting and requested to talk to Theresa May about it. And kind of inexplicably, Theresa May said that she didn't have time in her agenda to speak to them, and the meeting was denied, which then they saw as a kind of appalling diplomatic snub, and possibly also a racist snub. And so we had a piece about that on the front page of The Guardian, and it was extraordinary, the speed with which officials then began to fall over themselves to say, but of course we want to have these meetings. And within hours, Amber Rudd was at the dispatch box in the House of Commons, apologising for the really appalling treatment of this group of people by the Home Office and by the British government. So it was really amazing on the one hand, but it was also a bit kind of, I don't know, eyebrow raising, because literally 24 hours before, nobody within the government had been thinking about this group of people or in any way acknowledging that their treatment had been in any way bad, let alone appalling. And so, yeah, two weeks after that, in a kind of parallel row over whether or not there were deportation targets for people here illegally, Amber Rudd did resign.
Did you think she should have resigned? What about Theresa May?
I think most of the people who were affected by this problem felt that the architect of the policy was Theresa May, and there was a great deal of concern that by seeing Amber Rudd's resignation, they were worried, I suppose, that the government would then be able to say, well, the Home Secretary has resigned, we've said sorry, and we can move on. Whereas in reality, the legislation that caused all of this problem remained in place and remains in place now. So I felt a bit ambivalent about her resignation, I suppose.
Mm. Well, Sajid Javid, who was the next Home Secretary, promised to make the immigration scheme fairer. So you're suggesting he didn't?
I mean, it's been amazing, because we've had now apologies, really, really effusive apologies from 3 Home Secretaries and 2 Prime Ministers, and yet the legislation all remains in place. A lot of really positive things have happened. 12,000 people who didn't have documentation before do now have documentation, and this enormous compensation scheme has been launched, which officials say might end up paying out hundreds of millions of pounds, with a kind of upper limit of £500 million. But the really sad thing is that it isn't actually paying out that money yet, and only 60 people have had any compensation. So there's a real kind of disconnect between these extraordinary, well-crafted apologies that we keep having from minister after minister, and the experience of those people who've affected, a lot of whom remain in huge financial difficulty because they've had years without work, and who are still waiting for compensation.
What changes have I mean, I saw yesterday that you reported on twins born in this country who are facing deportation to 2 separate countries that they have never been to. One is the homeland of one parent and the other of another parent. Yeah. Do you fear this policy will return after the memory of your reporting fades?
Yeah, I mean, we had a promise from Priti Patel a couple of weeks ago that she was going to adopt all of the recommendations to reform the Home Office to make it a fairer and more compassionate institution. but I think that there's a kind of that there's kind of one message that is put particularly to Guardian readers, and then there's a parallel message that's perhaps put to readers of the Daily Mail, which is a much more robust one. And it's hard to know which way the government is actually going to go ultimately on this, because there's clearly a real feeling that being very tough on immigration is politically popular, even though this whole issue wasn't really about immigration. It wasn't really, I mean, it was just a terrible mistake that the government had made.
Yeah. I mean, some of the efforts you recount to put PR spin into the Windrush scandal are just quite galling. Some of the letters that you quote from, and the sort of general excitement over the 70th anniversary, and that felt galling.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was amazing, the efforts that officials took to look as though they valued the contribution of this generation of people who've arrived from the Caribbean. And that was kind of part of why I wanted to write this book, was because when you write newspaper articles, you kind of have to strip everything very bare of the detail, as you know, and it just was, it was good to be able to have more space in the book to kind of go into some of the more absurd behaviours of officials, and also to have more time to look at the lives of the people affected by all of this.
So, I mean, this book feels very important right now for the reason that you just mentioned, of the ramping up of hostility towards immigrants in rhetoric and actually, but also, which feels very relevant now, the tearing back of the veil on British attitudes to race. So your book seems to contribute to this slow dismantling of the myth that the British have always been great and open-minded and unprejudiced people. And one of your interviewees describes his experience as different to the sort of racism that people experience in America, but nonetheless says it's very present here. I think he said that there's this charm that sort of disguises it. I don't know if you can go into that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a comparison made by a few of the people I spoke to about, you know, the racism in America. They felt much more upfront, whereas in Britain we kind of all bend over backwards to pretend that we don't have a kind of racist thought in our head, and everything is sort of cloaked beneath layers and layers of politeness, and yet the ultimate result is the same. And there was a real feeling amongst most of the people affected by this Home Office scandal that it wouldn't have happened to them if they had been Australian, or if they'd been you know, white Eastern Europeans. And I think that is kind of largely backed up by their experiences. So yes, I think it's been an incredibly dispiriting experience to go through for most of those people who were caught up in this, because they arrived in the 1950s, 1960s. They kind of lived through all of the worst open racism of the 1970s and 80s, were beginning to feel like things had got better, at least superficially, and then, you know, really had that kind of optimism drained out from them.
I mean, are you worried that the EU citizens who have been given so-called settled status here will face problems similar to the Windrush generation in the future?
It's the Home Office is quite worried that that, you know, that the Home Office is quite keen to show that they've learned from this Windrush problem, and that they are trying to make sure that it won't happen. The problem is that the numbers are so enormous. There's something like 3.5 million EU nationals who are waiting to get, who are obliged to get settled status, of whom actually a very large proportion already have successfully got some sort of status. But the problem is that even if you have a kind of 5% failure rate or 5% of kind of non-compliance, or people don't realize that they have to do it, that's an enormous number. That's kind of tens of thousands of people who themselves could, in the next few years, find themselves embraced by the same hostile environments. So yeah, I think it's very possible, unless there is reform of the key bits of legislation that put all of the impetus on, put all of the onus rather on landlords, employers, NHS staff to do all of these checks.
Yeah. It's a very important story, but it's also has this it has the drive of a journalist, an investigative journalist, finding a story. You describe yourself in the book as obsessive, and you certainly are relentless in your research. How long did it take? How much of your life was taken up with it? How did it affect your family life, which in your case had its complications at the time because your husband was back then working for the government? On the sort of journalistic, investigative journalist, how it impacts your life. When you see it in a film, you see someone sort of staying up late and researching and stuff. I just wondered how that was in your life.
I think my family is, all of them are mightily fed up with the phone calls that I get from the Home Office press office at really peculiar times of day. I had a call last night when I was asleep at 11:30 from the Home Office press office, and it's sort of a joke within my house. Whenever the phone goes, everyone's like thinking that they're coming back with more questions. It was quite complicated, and I think particularly for a month when around the time that the government began to apologise, it was all consuming. And yes, definitely complicated for Joe because at that time he was colleagues with Amber Rudd, and I think that probably wasn't amazingly fun for him either. But it's something that we've had to navigate for a long time. But as a journalist, as you know, I mean, most of the time we kind of spend lots of energy in writing articles, and then the nature of it is that they kind of get forgotten about a few weeks after. And I think this is the only time in my career that I've done something that has had a real kind of tangible impact. And that's again why I wanted to kind of write about this, because it's a book that's about the kind of very technical immigration policy, but it's also a bit about what it's like to be in a newsroom, the kind of times when you feel depressed, the times when you feel a bit cross with your editors because they're not putting your article in the place that you want to, and the frustrations of doing that work.
And there are some great descriptions as well of you going to Jamaica and trying to work and sort of with jet lag and, at each end of the day with very little sleep and, in sort of interviewing in quite difficult circumstances. So is good journalism like this under threat now in a contracting industry?
I think we're going into another very horrible time for media organisations post COVID, and with advertising funding disappearing again. And I think that does have an impact because this kind of reporting is you don't really know when you're going to be just wasting your time or when you're working productively. So it does, it requires a kind of well-staffed newsroom, and that's not something that comes cheaply, I suppose.
Yeah. So what will your next book be about? Have you got a new one? Have you got a novel in you, as they always ask?
I would love to have a novel in me, but I don't know. I found the process of writing quite hard work. I mean, writing a book obviously it's kind of
You wrote it in 4 months. No record.
It was very, very fast and quite not a totally fun experience. So I'll see. I'm not sure.
And people like talking about writing method. I mean, we've touched on this a bit. Basically, it sounds like you tore through it for a tight deadline, just like reporting. But did you have a sort of method?
Well, I think I was really lucky in a way to have this immensely tight deadline of 4 months. But I kind of look back at it, and it's a bit like having been pregnant and created a baby. It sort of happened, and I kind of can't really remember how I managed to do it. But I had kind of weekly chapters. I had to write a chapter a week, and just made myself, but not fun. No.
Very good discipline, very good and disciplined. The only other thing I was going to ask you about was sometimes you say you get messages on Twitter noting that people saying that they don't want white voices writing about Black issues. And you said it was very hard to respond. I just wondered if you could just say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about it a lot, and I find it less hard to respond now, I think, because I think it's not helpful to look at reporting like that, because in a newsroom, people, as a journalist, you have to be able to report on any issue, and you can't really allocate stories according to the background of the journalist. And if you did, it would be ridiculous. I mean, I think we do have a problem within British media, as probably internationally, around diversity, and at The Guardian it's got a lot better, but we perhaps historically still have a newsroom which doesn't totally reflect the world outside. So, that's a very important kind of criticism to make of all media organisations. But the idea that you should only have white voices writing about white issues, or the inverse, is just unhelpful, because it's kind of very, very restrictive to everybody. And I've worked abroad in Russia and in India and in France before, and it's kind of, you have to just trust the reporter to be able to to be well informed and able to grapple with any topic.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Amelia, for coming on and for talking about this. It's a really, really, really good book, and it's actually really gripping, even though it's very, as you say, it's very technical, because of the way you describe the whole process of putting it together. And it makes me feel like I should be doing better journalism.
Thank you for having me on here, and you do excellent journalism.